Welcome and thank you for attending today's Ergo Expo webinar. In just a few minutes, we'll meet Nigel Heaton and Guy Osmond. We'll be speaking about the Millennial Employees, the Ergonomic Tsunami. But first, thank you to our sponsor, Cardinus Risk Management. Cardinus offers a wide range of risk management and health and safety solutions, including ergonomic solutions, e-learning, occupational road risk, property risk management, and consultancy. We're thrilled to have Cardinus sponsor our event today. And we're especially thrilled to have Ryan Pavey on the line. Ryan is an Associate Director of Marketing and Partnerships for Cardinus, and he'll join us a little later in the presentation. We also want to thank our media partner, Industrial Hygiene News, and our academic partner, the University of Michigan. Our speakers today are Nigel Heaton and Guy Osmond. Nigel is Director of Human Applications. He provides training, consultancy, and audit services around a wide range of risk management issues. He has acted as an expert witness for claimants and defendants and works for a great number of large organizations advising boards and senior management on how to develop effective risk management strategies. He is a fellow of the Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, a charter member of the Institution of Occupational Safety, a member of the International Institute of Safety Risk Management, and a member of the Institute of Risk Management. Nigel's co-presenter is Guy Osmond. Guy has been in workplace ergonomics for more than 20 years. His company is the UK's most knowledgeable supplier of innovative products and services to improve workplace well-being and productivity. Guy's team has a range of specialist skills not generally found among mainstream office furniture suppliers, and he prides himself on sourcing outstanding products from all over the world. Guy's specialties include ergonomics, reducing workplace absenteeism and presenteeism, improving productivity, and addressing musculoskeletal problems and disabilities in the workplace. He blogs and speaks frequently on topics including flexible working in the changing office environment, and he's a frequent Ergo Expo presenter. Now, just a few reminders before we get started. Be sure your computer's volume is turned up so you can hear the audio. If you experience any issues with the audio, please press the request button in the participants box at the top right corner of your screen to receive further instructions. To ask a question during the event, you may use the Q&A panel located on your screen. Within 24 hours, you'll receive a link to the archived version of the presentation that will be available online approximately 3 days after today's webinar and will be available for 1 year. If you encounter a problem during today's webinar, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. After today's webinar, a short survey will pop up. Once completed, you will then be able to print a certificate of completion and use it to apply for CEUs with ABIH and BCSP directly. You can easily view today's or previous webinars in the Webinars tab of ergoexpo.com. On the right side, you'll see all the available on-demand webinars for you to view at your convenience. And for even more ergonomics education, plan on attending the 2015 Ergo Expo. Today's webinar is a perfect example of the high-level education you'll get at the conference. Plus, you'll have the opportunity to see and compare all the latest industry products. Now, with that, I would like to turn it over to Nigel. Welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. As Daniel said, my name is Nigel Heaton. I hope you enjoy today. I do have a habit of using TLAs, or three-letter acronyms. When I talk about MSDs, I mean musculoskeletal disorders. So let's begin at the beginning. We need to decide what's different about today's young people. Guy's going to talk about why a tsunami a bit later on. And I want to start off by considering what young people do today that might make them more prone to musculoskeletal disorders. And it seems to me that we have a bunch of people out there whose exposure to the sort of risk factors, which I will cover a little later, whose exposure to these risk factors is fundamentally changing. We see a proliferation of technology, of games, of handheld devices, whether they're mobile phones, whether they're any sort of iPads or those sort of tablet devices. We see laptops everywhere. We see ubiquitous use of laptops, whether it's in the office, on a train, on a plane, in a hotel room. And we also see that young people, they're used to interacting with new technology. They spend more time. They spend their days interacting not just with one device, but with multiple devices. Even not just with one device at one time, but with multiple devices simultaneously. I have a son who's recently left teenagerhood behind, and I watch him watching a film on TV, chatting with his friends over Facebook, looking about the film on his laptop, and if he can get away with it, playing one of those amazingly stupid games on his mobile phone. So why do young people who have this change in exposure, why might they be more prone to having musculoskeletal disorders? And I think it comes down to the fact that when you're young, you have the body of a god or a goddess. You feel fit, you feel athletic, you feel great. You're able to do things. You're able to perform incredible feats of stamina, incredible feats of concentration. You actually might believe that you are largely indestructible. Sadly, in Europe, we see it in the behavior of young male drivers who have lots of accidents because they believe they are the world's best drivers the minute they're able to drive. And there's a challenge about musculoskeletal disorders. They're the sort of thing that happens to your mum or dad. They're the sort of thing that old people suffer from. They're cumulative. They're insidious. And they're non-acute. In other words, it takes us a long time potentially to develop significant problems. They're hidden from us, and they don't tend to be the result of one single thing. And there's a second problem, which is we often ask people whether they feel comfortable. And the way that we as humans tend to define comfort is through the absence of discomfort. In other words, if we say to somebody, "Are you comfortable?" typically the way that they interpret that, the construct of comfort that they apply is, am I actually uncomfortable? Am I suffering from discomfort? And if the answer is no, then I'm comfortable. And that's a challenge, because sometimes what people feel isn't always a good touch, a good indicator as to whether they're actually safe, whether they have good ergonomics posture, whether they have the right map for what good feels like. If you are small, if you're a small female, by the time you enter the workforce, you will be used to your feet regularly not touching the floor, not touching the ground. When you're sitting on a bus, on a train, on a plane, your feet never touch the ground. If you're a particularly tall male, you will be used to stooping all the time. And we don't give our kids much of a chance. When you're in elementary school, you join at the age of 4 or 5, maybe 6, and you sit in a chair. You might double in height, double in weight. You might have lots of body changes over the next 5 years. And you sit in the same chair. You sit at the same desk. And then you go into high school, you go into middle school. And lo and behold, you're still using a one-size-fits-all furniture. And when we're at home, the way in which we sit, the couches we sit on, the dining room chairs we sit at, They're fixed. And they give us an education in what it feels like to sit. And then we have our parents and our teachers who say to us, sit up straight, sit cross-legged, sit in a way that defines comfort for us as children, which by the time we enter the adult workforce, we have to shake off. Now, we've talked about this being a tsunami, but is there any evidence that actually any of this stuff really matters? And clearly, we've seen now numerous studies, particularly in Europe and a couple in Australia and New Zealand, which say, do you know what? There are warning signs for young people. In Switzerland, children as young as 6 were reporting back problems. Now, those back problems were linked to things like asymmetric loading. You carry a heavy school bag to school, but also things like whether parents smoked and what gender, with evidence that young girls appear to be more prone to these conditions than young males, young boys. We found in Finland that as you move into adolescence, as you start to use computers and handheld devices and interact with games more regularly, with usage as little as small as 2 hours a day, infrequently, which isn't very much, we start to see MSD symptoms. Accompanying this particular presentation, there is a white paper and quite a comprehensive list of additional research, all of which kind of indicates that there's a problem. And I thought it's worth reflecting with you some basic statistics. We've known for a long time, if we take the issue of back pain and back problems, that they are quite significant. To give you some feel for that, we think that an average back injury, back pain, back problem will result in about 10 days off work. Now, that is not saying that every time you get a bad back you have 10 days off. What it says is, if the average is that, we know some people have a couple of days off, but we also know a worryingly large number of people have time off which can be measured not in days, sometimes not even in weeks, but in months. And we also know that a back problem can be a gift for life. Like a diamond, it can last forever, but it's not the sort of gift that you would necessarily want to receive. And we know that the time between back pain and back problems, the time between episodes, is on average 5 years. And if you put that in context, if we have a young person who actually trips into injury at the start of their working career, by the time they retire, they might have had up to half a year off work. And I mean, to put that in context, there's been numerous studies in America, but let me just talk about a couple of them I think are interesting. A 15-year-old study that was done looking at lower back pain in the USA indicated that about a quarter, just over a quarter of the US industrial population would suffer from back pain, with 8% of them being disabled in any given year. That means having time off work. More recently, there was a study done in the US looking at back pain which required emergency admission into an emergency department. And in the year that the study was done, there were in excess of 2 million people going into emergency departments with back pain. And the evidence is that that is a trend that is growing. So it kind of begs the question, what are the risks? And it is worth observing at this point that all the research indicates the risks haven't really changed. And I guess the US father of musculoskeletal disorders is Vern Putz Anderson. And nearly 30 years ago now, Putz Anderson talked about 6 risk factors. And these, I think, are as relevant now as they were when he first defined them. And he observed that people who were exposed to more than one risk factor were maybe more exposed to risk, more prone to injury. He talked about the idea that force was important. If you applied excessive force to any one part of your body, any tendon, any muscle, then maybe you would trip into injury. If you did something that was bad for you, the more often you did it, the more repetitious you were, the more prone you were to injury. He talked about bad posture, and it's worth reflecting that when we talk about bad posture, any posture that you hold for long enough is a bad posture. Similarly, when we talk about lack of rest, we don't mean that people need to sit down more. People need to put their feet up. Lack of rest in a musculoskeletal context actually might mean getting up and moving. Sedentary posture, which we hold for too long, can massively increase the risk of a musculoskeletal disorder. So when we talk about rest, when we get to our break time, we don't want people to put their feet up and rest. We want them to get up and move. Stress is huge. I actually act as an expert witness. I did quite a lot of work around people who have problems and help them with looking at where causation lies. And it's fair to say I see very strong correlation between people who have self-defined stressful jobs or stressful environments and people getting musculoskeletal disorders. And I think that we need to recognize that the body's ignoring the psychological and emotional changes that are associated with stress. The physical changes, that feeling of tension, basically is your body telling you that something's wrong. And we know that our muscles occur in opposing pairs, and that when we are tense, all of our muscles are a little bit contracted. So when we do normal movements, because all of our muscles are contracting, because our muscles are occurring in opposing pairs, we're actually making our body work harder. When we do a simple action, not only are we requiring a muscle to contract, we're also requiring it to contract against its antagonist muscle, which is also slightly contracted. And then I guess the real interesting factor is that it just looks like some people are susceptible to MSDs. And that's not very comfortable to organizations, because they might have 4 people in a room who do identical jobs, have identical equipment, sit in identical chairs, and one of them just trips into injury. It is fair to say, in terms of individual susceptibility, the single biggest marker for whether somebody will suffer a musculoskeletal disorder is whether they've previously suffered a musculoskeletal disorder. We know that people who have behavior patterns, who have physical, anatomical propensity to trip into injury, we know that they might be more prone to injury, and we might need to manage them more proactively. I guess, though, whilst these are the risk factors, we've kind of moved on in one sense, and that is to say, when do these risk factors actually matter? And at this point, we need to consider, I think, 3 really important telltale factors that say, is somebody going to get injured? And those 3 are, how long, in kind of absolute terms, how many hours per day does somebody interact with technology? Does somebody sit in a sedentary posture? Does somebody do stuff that is suboptimal? How long per day do people spend interacting with technology in a suboptimal way? How long do they actually go without rest? And for me, probably the single most important factor, the single most important marker is that absolute measure of duration. Do people spend 2, 3, 4 hours without getting up and moving? Because those are really, really bad habits. And how much pressure do people feel? And do you know, that pressure idea is not just about, do I feel that I have to do my job? You can feel pressure if you're playing a game. I have to beat the boss. You can feel pressure if you're interacting with your friends. I have to get to this level before they do. So when we talk about the risk factors, we also talk about, I think these are measures of likelihood or probability. The frequency, duration, intensity, combined with the risk factors, give us a real indication as to whether people are genuinely at risk. And that means, if you look at those three factors there, that a typical working day doesn't actually define the likelihood, the exposure. Because when we see things like using technology on buses, on public transport, using technology whilst you're just having your sandwich at your desk, using technology when you go home, all of those can massively increase the likelihood. So we need to think about the habits that people have. And those habits are not necessarily what we would encourage. So people who habitually use technology all of the time might be more prone to musculoskeletal disorders. And if we look at the habits of young people, what we see is their exposure is starting to change. And it's worth understanding a little bit of anatomy and physiology, not too much, you'd be relieved to hear, but a little bit about understanding about where problems actually do occur. And I'm just going to look at a couple of bits of the body and just talk through some basic stuff that you probably already know. But when we talk about, for example, wrist problems, as you probably know, in America, carpal tunnel syndrome and carpal tunnel release operations are a very common form of elective surgery. What do we mean by carpal tunnel syndrome? What we mean is if people use their technology with their wrists outside of the neutral, in particular with something called extension or ulnar deviation, we'll look at those in a minute, we have a problem. The carpal tunnel is the tunnel formed by the carpal ligament, and essentially that tunnel is what is used to run tendons from muscles in your forearm to work your fingers. Essentially, your fingers work by muscles contracting and relaxing in your forearm. If you want to do a very advanced anatomical experiment on yourself, if you grasp one of your arms, one of your forearms, and wiggle your fingers, you should feel something moving. If you don't, you probably need quite significant help. You may be dead. Just check if you can feel those tendons moving around. In fact, you're actually not just feeling the tendons, you're feeling the things that the tendons are wrapped in, these synovial sheaths. And because they all go through this very narrow space, this so-called carpal tunnel, we have a problem. And that is that if we start to damage these tendons or the sheaths that wrap them up, one of the symptoms of damage might be that the tendon or the synovial sheath starts to swell. And what it swells into is other tendons wrapped in synovial sheaths. And they too become damaged, and they start to swell. And ultimately what happens is the carpal tunnel becomes cramped and full of swollen tendons and synovial sheaths, so-called tendinitis or tenosynovitis, and they tend to put pressure on the median nerve. And you get a big ouch. At that point, you get a big ouch. And again, if you want to do an anatomical and physiological experiment, not one that I'm recommending anybody does, but if you hit your elbow hard on your desk or wherever you're sitting on a sharp object, what you will feel is numbness and tingling. You'd say, I've trapped or hit my funny bone, because basically you are trapping a nerve. And that numbness and tingling that you feel when you trap your funny bone basically is what you get when you get carpal tunnel syndrome. The median nerve, you get a constant pain. You get a numbness and tingling around that nerve, and it goes all the way potentially up to your neck. So we know that we can damage our wrist by moving out of that nice neutral position. And my experience is extension, particularly caused by people who don't type correctly, who type resting their wrists on the table in front of a fat keyboard or even a thin keyboard. Ulnar deviation as well, caused by people who basically angle their wrists as they type or as they use their mouse or as they use their handheld device. Those are the things that we think will trip people into potential problems. But it's not just the arm that is affected by all of this. We also know stuff about the back. And we also see now why the teacher's advice to sit up straight is fundamentally flawed. We should be taught to sit up curvy. The back is made up of a series of things called vertebrae, relatively small bones, separated by things called intervertebral discs, which are kind of cushions. And the vertebrae are arranged in relation to each other as a double S shape. And out of these intervertebral discs emerge nerves. And here is a problem. If we look at the lumbar region, if we start to move those intervertebral discs around, by moving the vertebra, by moving those bits of your spine, by adopting unsupported, awkward postures in our back, we can cause the discs to either stretch or bulge. And if they particularly bulge, one of the things that they will bulge into is a nerve. And when that bulges into a sciatic nerve, we call it sciatica. So we know that failing to support the lumbar curve properly, people who have poor lumbar lordosis, people who have poor curvature in their lumbar region, are more prone to these sort of musculoskeletal disorders. And the challenge is that when we trip into a musculoskeletal disorder, we can very rapidly find ourselves in a vicious circle. We overload our soft tissues and we become injured. It hurts. There's a change in the tissue. We get inflammation. It reduces our movement. Our muscles might go into spasm. They might permanently lock. Our soft tissues shorten, overloading them more. And what we see is people who get into these sort of vicious circles can develop chronic injuries. They trip into chronicity. And at that point, we end up managing problems. And what we know is the earlier we intervene, the more likely we are to be successful. The later it is, the less successful. The less we understand what causes the problem in the first place, the less able we might be to actually get rid of the problems after they've occurred. So what is it about young people that matter? The first thing to say is we need to recognize straight up that it might not necessarily be work that's causing the problem. I was asked to help a large organisation who had an employee, and she had a particular problem. She was complaining of all sorts of aches and pains. And they looked at her workload, and they looked at her posture, her desk, her chair, her keyboard. They did what they thought was right. They did everything they thought was right. And I spoke to her, and I looked at her, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then she told me definitively she knew it was work that was giving her the problem. Because she could easily spend 3 or 4 hours at night writing up her PhD on her dining room chair, and that didn't give her any problems at all. We also recognize, certainly from the Swiss studies and the Finnish studies, that young people entering the workforce may have pre-existing conditions, may have bad habits which might trip them into injury more quickly than we would normally anticipate. And it seems to me that we need some pragmatic advice. First of all, as I've said before, the thing that I really think would be important is to tackle the static problem, excessive static. One of my colleagues, Dr. Claire Williams, has just done a study using a small accelerometer, a small device that you put on your belt to try to encourage people to take more regular breaks. And it measures the angle of the back, and it also buzzes when people have had a bad posture for more than an hour. And what she found was that actually initially people were getting lots of buzzes, but at the end of the study people were getting very few buzzes because they got into the habit of avoiding the buzz by moving. We know that static posture thing is something that we need to address. We also know that where multiple factors are present, people are prone to wrist and neck problems. We know that, as I said, excessive extension, ulnar deviation, and in particular necks, where screens are too high. We only really have two muscles at the back of our neck, which allows us to hold our head in the right position. Our head's quite heavy. It's quite heavy. It's, several kilograms, 10, 15 pounds, whatever. It's a good weight loss tip. If you want to lose weight quickly, chop your head off. Again, not one that I'm recommending, but certainly we know that the weight of the head, with the small muscles holding it, if it is held in the wrong position for too long, we know that people develop problems. And we also know that lower back problems associated with inadequate lumbar support or poor postures really matter. And that means that physical features like furniture, like chairs, like screens are important. But we also know we have to encourage people to report early. As I've said before, it is incredibly important that we capture symptoms early. Now, how early? It depends on how confident your colleagues are that they will be treated sympathetically and that actually they are able to report problems. In terms of practical solutions, it seems that we absolutely see a role of training. It's non-intuitive. Good posture, non-intuitive. Absolutely important to understand that if it was intuitive, people would not have problems. And we can't be normal in our training. We can't be boring. If we're appealing to young people, if we want to get people to engage in this, we basically have to be clever. We have to screen people. We have to test how they are, how fit they are. We don't want to discriminate against people who have MSDs or early warning signs, but we need to recognize that some people might have them and we need to treat them sympathetically. I've said it before, early reporting is hugely important. People have to have the confidence, the knowledge to report early and understand what their body's telling them. Listen to your body. It's a really hard thing to do. People quite often are used to, if you work in a gym, working through the pain. Go through the pain barrier. We don't want that at work. It's great if you're an elite athlete. Rather less good if you're an office worker. And we need clever assessments. They need to be quick. They need to be easy to apply. They need to be valid, and they need to be applicable not just to computers, but to any other sort of technology. And in terms of just possible wins, get people to move more. Get people sitting in quality chairs. And for those of you who haven't had it at high school, I want people to type. There are huge advantages of being a touch typist. And I know that most Americans, or many Americans, are taught to touch type. Many Europeans are not. It is absolutely a fantastic win. If you can type without looking at the keyboard, there are huge postural benefits. And finally, a technology one, which is separate keyboards and screens to give you more flexibility. On that bombshell, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Guy Osmond, who's going to kind of take some of the themes that we've developed in the last 30 minutes a bit further. Guy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Good evening from sunny Bournemouth, where we're 200 yards from the sea, and good morning to many of you, and thank you for attending our webinar. Picking up on some of the topics that Nigel's been discussing here, obviously we now need to think about what we might do about some of this stuff. Just a quick note before we do, I thought I would just pick up on why I thought originally of this expression, ergonomic tsunami. It's in the title. It's just my view that the way we're looking at this, with the young people coming into the workplace, the issues they will be raising in ergonomics terms, the millennial employees, the tsunami, it's coming, it's enormous, it's unstoppable, and it's potentially overwhelming, which is why we all think this is a really important topic. So, for those of you who have not already decided that the best option is simply to think seriously about retirement, what are we going to do if we're going to stay in the workplace and address these issues for our workforce generally, but in particularly our younger employees? So I have suggested that we look at these 4 issues to review: your assessment or evaluation processes, your training, your product portfolio, and possibly your supply partners, because if they're not on board with these sort of topics and don't really grasp them, then you're going to be behind the curve all the time. So if we go on and pick up on these issues, let's look first of all at your assessment processes. First of all, looking back at when I first started in the ergonomics arena, which was in 1992, when I first started, there were about the typical scenario for people showing musculoskeletal issues were more commonly women, normally 50 years old or older, typically secretarial, or certainly those doing keyboard work. And so what we're now seeing is that's completely different. Over the last 23, 24 years since I've been involved in workplace ergonomics, we are seeing far more younger people coming into the workplace, as we've already been discussing, and the average age of those we are treating and addressing the needs is coming down progressively. So we can no longer think of this as an aging workforce issue or a middle-aged workforce issue. The whole point of what we're discussing today is this is something that's we need to address for people as they come into the workplace. So one of the things we need to do, those of you listening in Europe will be familiar with the fact that it's a requirement under regulations within Europe to address the needs and the assessment process, the evaluation process for computer users in the workstation. It should be a proactive process, picking up on this very early on, the first time people start work within the organization, but also it's a requirement to review this every time their workstation layout changes. It's very common that this is done, but equally there are an awful lot of employers within Europe who are not necessarily following these regulations accurately. And I know that from the many people I've spoken to in North America from various different employers, that approaches vary right across the spectrum. So picking up on the comments that Nigel's made, people may be coming into work with pre-existing conditions, with bad habits, and so it's really important because these issues, they're cumulative, they're very often hidden, they're typically non-acute in the early stages, and quite often they're a long way into those stages. So it's really important to be proactive about how you do this, to make sure you're looking at people as they join your organizations and looking constantly at their behaviors and their conditions so that you can actually be on top of this before it gets out of hand. Equally, and Nigel's touched on this already, what are they doing outside of work? This has become a much more critical issue. Have been at a conference in the UK today. One of the delegates we were talking to historically used to play role-playing games till 4 a.m. and she's now a health and safety advisor, so she's learned better at that. But typically, when you're talking to people in the workplace, what they're doing outside the workplace may be much more significant. So those are things you need to look at, whether they're game players, whether they're poker players, whether they're Xbox fanatics or whatever it happens to be. These things can be absolutely crucial to the nature of the musculoskeletal issues that may evolve. And finally, depending what sort of return on investment calculations you do and the nature of your workforce, it's really probably worth going back and looking at those methods, how you justify your Ergo program, and looking at what might be relevant in this new context and how you might review those. A good example of that might be that you look at your training costs. Very often within many organizations, the costs of training new personnel are very high, but if they're actually already in a state of beginning to deteriorate or may already have, as we said, pre-existing conditions, you're going to have lost that investment in their training much sooner than historically you might have done. So that's something worth looking at, again, in terms of how you approach this. So really important is to step right back and completely look at your existing training program. Looking at your posture guidance training, whatever you provide for that. Nigel has already said and stressed that good posture is not intuitive. What's really interesting here is I think you will find that a lot of your millennial workers coming into the workplace will be adopting postures which are intuitive to them, which are completely alien to you when you step back and observe them. And what you may well find, and this is something we've come across, is because they've been working using computer devices almost since they were born, they will have adopted whatever are comfortable postures and practices for them, whether it might be lying on the bed or sitting on a sofa or in front of the TV. And so they will have certain muscle memory patterns that the brain remembers about how certain postures are adopted and maintained and continued. So they will have muscle memory, which may mean that when you show them how to hold a mouse or how to set the chair right or set the screen right, that will actually be not only alien to them, but possibly even uncomfortable. And equally, that will impact how they use product because of that muscle memory issue and because of their former habits. So you might well be trying to untrain all manner of things that they think are intuitive and natural, and actually you're saying are totally unsuitable. So email management, again, perhaps not seen as an ergonomics issue, but an enormous productivity issue. This is something we look at. I know Nigel's picked up on touch typing, which equally is another big topic. But for us, email management, we found organizations that address this. There's a number of ways you can do it, switching it off at night and so forth, but we much prefer using the inbox zero concept. And if you're not familiar with inbox zero, it pretty much sounds as it is. But there's some really good stuff you can find on YouTube. So if you just search Inbox Zero, that's a good place to look at how people manage their email, how they reduce the stress from it, how they reduce the workload from it. And equally, when you're looking at email management, think about the other methods of communication these people are used to. So it might be social media, multimedia, Snapchat, Instagram, as well as the things you may be using in-house like Link and Chatter and so forth. Look at your etiquette. You may need to actually teach people what you may consider normal etiquette. You may even see it as normal good manners. But actually, simple things like, please don't look at Facebook when we're in the middle of a conversation, or please don't respond to a tweet as a knee-jerk reaction when actually we're in the middle of a meeting. Those sort of things may need to just make clear to people and set standards for what many might say is obvious and simple and straightforward and natural behavior, but the millennials coming in may not see it as that. And equally etiquette, things about how people use and work in open spaces, use of telephones, mobile phones, if they may be distracting the people in hot desk areas and so forth. There's a lot of things that you may find you simply think are obvious and, as I say, good manners, but need to actually be more clarified to people coming into the workplace with very different attitudes. Similarly, when you look at all this, you need to check your resources because clearly you'll be finding the training resources you use will need to actually be reviewed in the light of these sort of topics. Product portfolio, really important. Speak to your IT department. Are they about to implement tablets? Are they changing to thin clients? Are they introducing web books and so forth? Different types of computers. It's really important to know what's happening. We very often talk to people in occupational health and safety and ergonomics. The first time they know that, for example, tablets have been rolled out within the organization is when they start to get complaints for individuals about back and neck problems. Equally, in that context, do you have a bring your own devices policy? That makes it even more complicated to manage, but you need to be thinking about these topics so you can bring your Ergo program aligned to the sort of technology that people are being given or want to use. Similarly, have you looked at we've dealt with a number of American employers in Europe, and typically it's very common to have a set of approved products. Have you looked at that recently? Have you purged it? Have you seen whether you need to add to it? Have you checked whether all the products are still available? We've certainly looked at a number of lists in the last few years where it's almost inevitable, we find, when we look through a list, there's at least one or two products that are simply not available anymore. And are they relevant to the sort of activities and the sort of equipment people are using? And then finally, it may or may not be relevant, but look at your supply partners. Do they understand all this stuff we've been talking about today? If they do, then fantastic. They can help and support you through it. But if they don't understand it, as I said earlier, potentially you're going to be at a disadvantage trying to process it. Looking at your assessment and evaluation processes, your e-learning. Obviously, this event is sponsored by Cardinus, and we work with them with a number of organizations. Unless you're really tiny, your organization will have to have a computer-based system to be effective, but make sure that that computer-based system is actually addressing all of those issues that you need to address and the sort of topics beyond the simple, straightforward workstation eval assessment process. Make sure your furniture fits with how people are working, and your furniture suppliers understand different modes of working, whether it's home working, smart working, hot desking, hoteling, etc. And make sure your other facilities align with that. And obviously your Ergo products, your mice, keyboards, laptop stands, whatever it is you use, make sure they all fit in with the conversations we've been having and the sort of things you need to do to actually make sure everything fits with your program that you're going to want to roll out. So with that, it's a bit of a race through, but we've only got an hour today. I'm now going to hand over to Ryan, who's going to pick up and talk about some of the really interesting stats coming out of children's MSDs, and indeed sum up for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. And actually, I'd like to start by thanking both Nigel of Human Applications and Guy of Osmond Ergonomics for their help with this. Cardinus work with partners quite a lot in some of the stuff we do, but these two companies we go to quite regularly for their assistance, just because of their knowledge within the kind of ergonomic sector. I'm going to come on to some stats in a moment, but just before I do, just to remind you, there is a question and answer session coming up when I've finished, and we've worked with Guy and Nigel to put together a supporting white paper for this event, and we'll make sure that everyone involved today gets a copy of that in the next few days. I'd like to start really by addressing why we asked Nigel and Guy to work with us on this particular topic. You know, why we chose it from everything that we could have done within the ergonomics, the broad range of ergonomics subjects we could have addressed. And really, it's a conversation we had with a pediatric physiotherapist a few years ago, who carried out a couple of studies in elementary schools and high schools in the UK. And there were truly some shocking discoveries. On screen right now, you can see that in elementary schools, known as primary schools in the UK, so we're talking 5 to 11-year-olds, and what we call years 3 to 6. 36% of elementary school children had experienced back and or neck pain in the last week, and 72% of those children had experienced discomfort or discomfort in their neck and back in the last year. Moving on. In high school, so we're talking in the UK from 12 to 16, 36% again of high school children had back or neck pain in the last week, and 64% in the last year. There was also some studies in the UK that showed children as young as 15 were showing posture-related arthritic changes on X-ray. And this coincides really with the increase in the use of technology within the school system. In the UK, obviously, we're a regulated country, so we're perhaps worse than anywhere else because, you know, you could argue we should know better. We look after our workers with ergonomic assessments, ergonomic training, whether that be face-to-face or via e-learning. But we do nothing for our children. But we boast, and everyone is happy with the fact that the use of technology in the school system is increasing. I've got some examples here on the next slide, which illustrate that quite nicely. We can see here that by the end of 2015 in the UK, there's going to be 242,000 tablets in the elementary school system and 170,000 in the high school system. And these are in line with government targets. But what you can see by 2020 is that they want 57% of elementary schools and 75% of high schools to provide tablets for each pupil. Now, coincide that with the fact that these children are getting absolutely no advice in the safe use of them. And you can see that this is a problem that's potentially going to get worse for employers as these children continually use technology throughout their school life, but also, as we touched on earlier, when they get home, when they're using tablets or games consoles or communicating on their smartphone, they probably use technology more than we do in the workplace. So when they enter the workforce, it could be that they enter with pre-existing medical conditions that we then have to manage through. So there's not a lot out there that actually deals with this. And through working with this pediatric physiotherapist, we developed a free-to-use e-learning solution for students. Absolutely no cost to it. The website Ergo for Students also includes tip sheets for parents and teachers' notes for use in the classroom. But basically, we've got e-learning courses for the 3 different age groups: elementary, high school, and then college and university, each with a slightly different tone, just talking about best practice for what our children and young adults should be doing from an ergonomic safety point of view. I'm going to leave it there and hand over to our host, Daniel, who can start giving us some of the questions that you've raised today.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, Nigel and Guy. That was a very interesting presentation. We do have quite a few questions already in the queue, so let's just jump right into them. First one here we've gotten in is, what is the effect of touchscreen technology over using a mouse controller as it pertains to MSDs?
Do you want me to take that, Guy? Or,
yeah, I'm happy for you to do that, Nigel. Thanks.
It's a really big challenge. If you look at the research, one of the problems is that people suffer from having, shall we say, stubby, grubby fingers. And using touchscreen technology, first of all, we tend to point and to gesticulate potentially, as we get more excited, harder. We also tend to underhit where we're aiming for. And it seems to me that there are challenges if you're using these long term, not if you're doing simple interactions, but certainly I think there are significant challenges with touch screens as the main way of interacting with technology. We're using it for long periods of time. And I would be particularly concerned about something called microtraumas, which is where if you keep hitting one finger on your touch screen continually, you basically might become more prone to damage to that finger. And it's not kind of like, we're not talking about life-threatening injuries. What we're saying is this type of injury is the sort of thing that you see with people who do these fine jobs with frequent repetitive movement of one particular digit. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. Thank you. Another question here. What do you suggest we can do to protect our children's backs while they are children?
For starters, I think educate teachers more. Looking at get teachers to help understand what good posture is. Look at the design of their satchels, what they carry, what they use to take stuff to school. Certainly, the notion asymmetric loading of kids carrying not only books now but laptops and various technology. Look at doing that. Make sure parents understand that it's really great for kids to play technology, but you're going to see now that I was a really mean father. I'm not having TVs and computers in kids' rooms, encouraging them to be active. I mean, we know from all the research that if we can get young men, young boys, active when they're between 14 and 16, they are likely to remain active for the whole of their life. If we can do the same for young girls, a quite significant percentage will remain active for all of their lives. So if we can do anything to encourage them to get good habits early, that's what we're really about. Let's get them into the idea that, you know what, you can do stuff to help yourself. And I think that's really important.
Okay, our next question here. What is the effect of obesity on MSDs?
Okay, if you think about people who've got extra subcutaneous fat on them, if we look at things like, let's say, the carpal tunnel, what we know is it tends to be quite small anyway. If you start to surround it by subcutaneous fat, if you're doing those sort of things, if you look at the way in which our joints are put together, particularly things like knees and elbow joints, they're not load-bearing. As we start to see changes in our physiology, if we start to see increases in basically the amount of fat we carry, the amount of weight we carry, we would expect to see quite significant problems. And it's fair to say that if you look at things, it's not just diabetes that you hit as you become significantly overweight. It is bad backs, it is bad knees, it is the inability to use your wrists and your fingers correctly. And clearly, there is a very strong correlation between people being significantly overweight, when we're talking about morbidly obese, and them being physical wrecks.
I think we have time for one more question here. And this comes in from listeners. So we educate ourselves on the risk, and we educate our clients on the risk. We've shown them how, but often that is not enough. What are your opinions on encouraging the behavior change?
Hardest of all, we know that, as Guy said before, when you have somebody who habitually has a bad posture, when we teach them how to sit in a well-supported way, it can feel uncomfortable. And I think the problem here is you should never feel as though you've cracked it. And for me, the most effective behavior changes programs are when everybody buys into the notion that this is what we're seeking to achieve, and everybody has the right to intervene when they see people doing dumb things with posture, and expect to be treated with courtesy and with sympathy, and expect to be responded upon. So I think the most effective programs that I see are where you buy into the idea it's a long-term habit that you're breaking, therefore it's going to take a long time to achieve, but if we're all in this together and we all agree that we all have the right to intervene on each other, it can actually drive change. I mentioned my colleague Claire Williams doing this research on changing postures. And I think part of the success was not just the buzzy thing, but it was also the notion that people almost had the right to say to somebody who was sitting, hey, you've been sitting for too long now, get up and move. And the people will be laughing, thinking that's a joke, and actually get up and move. So I think we shouldn't think it's a trivial, easy-to-fix solution. If it has taken you 10 or 15 years to develop bad habits, don't believe that simple training and a single kind of like ergo exercise class will sort you out.
Great.
Can I just quickly, Daniel, can I just possibly quickly come in, if only to prove I'm still here? We find these sort of things work in programs actually where it's part of a broader issue. So rather than just being an ergo program or a health and safety program, you involve your HR people, you actually make it more of a cultural event, a cultural project, and a cultural program, so that it's actually around the broader context of well-being and health and wellness and those sort of things. So it's actually an integral part of a much bigger corporate approach to the whole culture of the business.
Great. Well, thank you, Guy. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Ryan. A lot of great information, very useful. And once again, also thank you to Cardinus, our sponsor today. And we hope you enjoyed this webinar.